Hello, Dave here. How are you?
Good, how are you?
Better than I deserve. Who's calling? This here is America. Tell me your financial situation.
I think we can all agree on that we're broke.
Yo, what?
I feel like if the US called into the Dave Ramsey show, Dave would have a heart attack and then immediately prescribe his special recipe of rice and beans and beans and rice. Because you know it's bad when it's not just ordinary Americans that are having trouble paying down their bills, but it's also now American cities as well.
One study says that 53 of the largest cities in the United States haven't generated enough revenue to cover their bills.
We know that when people are in financial trouble, whether they're in debt or they're going broke, the traditional advice is to follow the 7 baby steps. Step 1, save $1,000. Step 2, pay off your debt. Step 3, save 3 to 6 months of expenses towards your emergency fund. Step 4, invest 15% of your household earnings towards retirement. Step 5, save for your kids' college fund. Step 6, pay off your home early. And step 7, build wealth and give. Those are the steps for a person. But what are the steps for entire cities across the US that are going broke? Because according to truthandaccounting.org, at least 53 cities across the US don't even have enough money to cover their bills. Now, when a city doesn't have enough money to pay its bills, that's a really big problem and it affects everyone.
We've got to be careful because you don't want to get into too much debt.
Rising debt may lead to dirtier streets, fewer public services, and tough decisions from public officials that need to make ends meet.
The cities that are in trouble, they have a cash flow problem.
US cities don't have a cash flow problem. They have a spending problem. Because out of the 75 cities that they looked at, they had a combined $307 billion worth of assets to pay their bills. But their debt, including retirement benefit promises, totaled $595 billion, or almost double that. Now, when a city can't afford to pay its benefits, it has to get that money somewhere. And that problem gets passed on to you, the taxpayer, in the form of higher taxes and reduced spending elsewhere, which is also why public services are not as good as what we remember them to be, why roads are getting worse, and why streets are getting dirtier. So in today's video, I want to show you the full problem, how we got here, and how cities actually hide this fact by underreporting the real numbers, how this all affects us, and ultimately what we can do about it. So let's get into it. Hi, my name is Andrei Jikh. Hope you're doing well. Come for the finance and stay for the baby steps, American City Edition. Now, there's 2 different types of distinctions, broke and not broke. Now, if a city owes more money than it has, they take that negative number and divide it by all the people living in that city, and the result is a number called the taxpayer burden number. Now, on the opposite side of that spectrum, if a city has more money left over after the bills are paid, they take that positive number, divide it by the amount of people living in the city, and the result is the taxpayer surplus number. In total, across the 75 major cities that they looked at across the entire US, 53 of them were given a taxpayer burden status. In other words, broke. They owed $288 billion. And it gets worse. They assigned each city a grade from A through F. A meant there was a surplus of $10,000 or more per person, all the way to F, where the burden was $20,000 or more. And what they found was pretty bad. If 75 of those cities were US students all sitting in the same classroom, they found that 5 of those students would get a failing grade. They'd be failing class completely. 22 of them would have a D, 26 of them would have a C, 21 would have a B, and only 1 of them would have an A. The top 5 best cities were Washington, D.C., Irvine, Plano, Lincoln, and Oklahoma City. But the top 5 worst cities were New York, Chicago, Honolulu, Philly, and Portland. So if we're gonna figure this one out, we have to look at how cities spend and make their money. When it comes to spending money, it's obviously very expensive for cities to do their city things. Now, in that CNBC video, they used New York City as their best example of how expensive it can get. And by best example, I mean the city that ranked absolutely the worst on their list. And that's because New York happens to rank as one of the most expensive cities in the US to operate because it has over 1,700 parks, 217 libraries, 11 public hospitals, 472 subway stations, over 177,585 affordable housing units, and over 8 million people shouting, "Hey, I'm walking here." Now that's a lot of money that the city has to pay people to run and operate those services, as well as the energy costs and all the other things associated with it. Which is also why cities have to make money. And besides raising taxes, one of the ways they make money is by creating what are called municipal bonds.
New York City sells municipal bonds to fund many of these projects.
A city's bonds are like your mortgage, for long-term expenditures, something that you're going to use over generally 10, 20, 30 years.
Municipal bonds are types of investments that cities and states issue or create that we as investors can buy into. Now, the idea is that by buying these municipal bonds, we are giving our money to the city. And with that money, the city can choose to do whatever it needs to do to operate itself. And in return, within a certain amount of time called the maturity date, the city gives our money back plus interest that's paid to us semi-annually or twice a year. Now, as an investor, you also have a choice for how long you park your money with the city for. You can go the short-term route, which is a bond that lasts anywhere between 1 to 3 years long, or you can go the long-term bond route, which is 10 years or longer. In general, the longer you park your money with the city, the higher your interest rate should be and the more money you should make. And also in general, the interest that you collect from holding onto those municipal bonds will also be free from federal taxes. And that is one of the biggest ways that cities and states make money.
But then we can use those bonds to build schools and invest in our water and sewer infrastructure and subsidize affordable housing. But then we've got to be careful because you don't want to get into too much debt.
And this is where the problem starts. We can't fix this problem because we're not having the conversation, because so much of this information gets obscured in how it gets reported through accounting. It's like one of those magic tricks that uses misdirection. You think the money's in one hand, but it's actually completely somewhere else. And that is not on accident. It was designed this way very much on purpose. New York City officials, for example, report that the city owes $96 billion, but Truth in Accounting found that the city's debt is almost double that at $177.6 billion. So how is it possible that the city is reporting roughly half of what it actually might owe? And New York City, by the way, is not the only city that's doing it this way. And that limits our conversation because we don't have access to the real information. The truth behind how and why this happens, if you're a nerd, is actually really interesting. So here's why, if you're ever driving and you notice the horrible quality of the road you're on, why streets are getting dirtier, why public services are not as good as what you remember them to be, and why taxes keep on going higher. One of the biggest reasons for all of this is something called a pension fund. Pension funds are just pools of money that both companies and workers put money into, which is then invested into the stock market with the hope of paying money out to people in retirement. And pension funds are extremely important to the US. According to publicplansdata.org, pension funds hold $5.3 trillion in assets, which pay for millions of retirees at the rate of $334 billion a year. Now, some private companies still offer pension plans, and if you work for the government, chances are you have access to one, but even if you don't, underfunded pension plans still affect everyone's quality of life. According to Stanford University, pension funds across the US are underfunded by about $1.6 trillion. So to put that in perspective, if people with a pension plan were owed $1, those pension plans would only be able to pay roughly 80 cents of the money owed. And more than half of the states in the US are below 80% funding on their pension plans, and less than 10 states are 100% funded or more. And underfunded pension plans, in some cases, can bankrupt an entire city, which is exactly what happened to Detroit in 2013.
If public officials invest funds in stock markets and the bet goes the wrong way, it can make or break a city. For example, retiree payment obligations are part of what sent Detroit into bankruptcy in 2013. In the fallout, Detroit temporarily revised its pension program to limit payouts to former employees.
So as part of the bankruptcy settlement, Detroit agreed to pay its retirees less than they were owed, which was already little to begin with. And that's a problem if a city can't figure out how to manage and spend its money, especially when it's combined with their reliance on the stock market to make up for the difference. When it doesn't, like it didn't in 2022, that can create huge problems. And it's cities like Chicago, Philly, Houston, Portland, and Miami that owe money that are most in trouble. And that's why the mayor of New York City introduced something called the PEG, or the Program to Eliminate the Gap and Spend Less Money.
So what the mayor announced was a series of 3 5% cuts that add up a little shy of 15%. A lot of those cuts that are being felt very, palpably by New Yorkers.
And the side effects of all of this is something we all feel in different ways. Like public libraries being closed for longer, classrooms getting crowded, quality of education going down, roads becoming more unsafe, and cities becoming dirtier, and on this goes, all the while people are expected to pay more and more in taxes to make up for the spending gap. And it's getting worse. More and more cities across the US are reporting stagnant revenue growth, like LA, which mostly relies on property taxes to fund its programs, and Portland just flat out says it's run out of resources.
Leaders see a fiscal cliff ahead as there are no funds left to address existing financial issues.
The demand for resources continues to surpass availability within the city.
So you can imagine then how much worse this problem gets when a city gets hit with an unexpected spending bill that relates to things outside of anyone's control, like climate change, storms, hurricanes, and other kinds of natural disasters, because those cities don't have the money to fix themselves. And it's not even a conversation that we're having because this information is cleverly disguised through accounting trickery.
Because the elected officials say year after year that the budget's balanced when they're using budgeting and accounting gimmicks to truly not balance the budget.
And that's because pension fund losses is not money that's yet paid out as an expense, so it doesn't get reported. It's an unrealized loss. And that's why things seem better than they actually are on paper. And that's also why politicians keep on spending money, because that's what makes people happy, that's what gets them reelected, but what it doesn't do is fix the problem. So how do we actually fix the problem? And this is where it gets really tricky, because the way that cities are handling these problems is by borrowing more money. New York City, for example, is trying to increase its debt ceiling by $12 billion so it can borrow even more. But here's the problem with borrowing money. If cities want to borrow money from the federal government, they can do that. But first, they have to make sure that they have a good credit rating. Because believe it or not, cities also have a credit score which affects the interest rate on borrowed money. And that can either make or break the city. The best credit rating ranges from AAA to BBB, which is considered investment grade. And cities that default on their bonds and payments have a junk bond status from BB to default, which is sometimes what cities have to do. They have to borrow money, but they have to do it at a reasonable interest rate.
The voters think, oh, they must be living within their means, and they're not. But if you can go ahead and use budgeting gimmicks and not have to raise taxes, but still provide a large amount of services and benefits, that's obviously beneficial to elected officials.
So what I learned from making this video is that a lot of American cities are in financial trouble. And they're in trouble because they can't fund their retirees and pension plans. So to make up for it, they stop paying their obligations, which can lower their credit rating and also lowers the quality of life for everyone, including people without a pension plan. Politicians, on the other hand, don't want to raise taxes and spend less money because they're afraid they won't get reelected. So instead, they choose to use accounting trickery to make it seem like everything is better than it actually is while they borrow and spend more money. And none of this will ever improve as long as the public doesn't know exactly what's going on. Now, I'm sure that I made this problem seem a lot less complicated than what it actually is, but it doesn't seem that complicated to me. Just spend less money than the city makes. If I was mayor of a city, I would never borrow money unless we had a AAA credit rating. And even if I did, I wouldn't borrow money at these insanely high interest rates because it's just not worth it. But if I had to, because sometimes that's what you have to do, I wouldn't borrow money just to pay my credit cards. That's like taking out a credit card to pay down your credit card. Instead, I would borrow money and reinvest it back into the city in a way that grew our revenues. That way, I could build up my credit rating if that's what I had to do and save more money, and that doesn't seem like rocket science to me. Living here in the South Las Vegas Valley area, a couple weeks ago, 2 of my tires exploded because I ran over a pothole. Our roads here are atrocious, and several dozen cars had the same thing happen to them over the course of a few weeks because the city just didn't fix it. So I know that we all experience this in different ways, but I'd love to get your thoughts about how you experience this and what you think we can do to fix this. But as always, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Smash the like button, subscribe if you haven't already. Don't forget to grab your free stocks, links are down below, and then go track them automatically with the spreadsheet link down below on my Patreon. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'd love to see you back here on Monday and Friday, sometimes a Wednesday. See you soon, bye-bye.